Good morning, everybody, or well, it's good morning at my time in Melbourne. So welcome to today's session. The future is feminist. This is part of the pre-conference series at the 2020 Research for Development Impact Conference, co-hosted by the University of Queensland. And looks like the flood of people have stopped coming in, so I think we can get started. So just before I pass on to Michelle, I'd like to introduce myself as Whitney Yip. I am the conference concierge, so you'll be seeing me quite, almost everywhere in the conference. And please, if today's session is open to the general public and all of our conference delegates. If you haven't already purchased a conference ticket, hopefully this will give you a bit of a taste and a preview of what's happening in the conference so that you can grab your tickets at rdiconference2021.com, .org.au. Thank you so much, and you can take it away, Michelle.
Thanks, Whitney. Welcome, everyone. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. Where I am, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I do encourage others joining from other lands, other First Nations lands, also to share where they're coming from and just pay that acknowledgement. So I'm Michelle Higelin. I'm the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia, and we're delighted to be co-hosting this session with the Shifting the Power Coalition as part of the Research for Development Impact Conference pre-session. As Whitney said, our session is The Future is Feminist, Gender Transformative and Inclusive Development. And we're hoping that this session will explore how feminist organisations and women's collectives in the Pacific are shifting the power across the development and humanitarian divide to transform gender relations and drive inclusive community-led approaches. And we're going to be sharing examples of this through the Shifting the Power Coalition in the Pacific, which we'll explain a little bit more about shortly, as well as the 4,000 women strong Women Talk Together network in Vanuatu. I guess to start off with, I would say we imagine this as a round table. And so I think we want to see ourselves sitting around a table where we have some women and all Pacific women coming and sharing some of their perspectives, but also to open it up and to hear perspectives from others in the audience, but also a chance to interact and hear questions. So we have designed this to be interactive. And I do encourage you to put questions or comments into the chat. We'll monitor that. We'll definitely have a time for more interactive discussion, but we'll try and weave that into our conversation as we go. To start off with, I would also like to welcome our speakers today and introduce them. We have Sharon Bhagwan-Rolls, who's in Suva and is the Regional Manager for the Shifting the Power Coalition. Welcome, Sharon. We also have Flora Vano, who is in Port Vila right at the moment as the government faces disruption, and the country manager of ActionAid Vanuatu that has supported the development of the Women Talk Together network. Welcome, Flora.
Thank you.
Let me see if we do have Lanieta Tuimabu on the line from the Fiji Disabled People's Federation and also a member of the Pacific Disability Forum Women's Network. We think that Lanieta is just having a few technical issues joining, so she hopefully will be with us shortly as she was sort of all primed, ready to participate today. And our other speaker we have today is Carolyn Kitione, who is the Regional Young Women's Focal Point also for the Shifting the Power Coalition. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thanks, Michelle. Mula, everyone.
And Carolyn's also coming to us from Suva. So I guess to get started and to kick off this discussion, we wanted to start by sharing a a framework of how we've set up this conversation. And I guess just to explain this before we share it, I guess what we know from the growing body of research, obviously, that climate change and disasters are undermining development in the Pacific. And in fact, Vanuatu sits at #1 in the Global Disaster Risk Index. So it's the country most at risk of disasters. And we also know that Pacific leaders have identified climate change as the greatest security threat to the region. The other thing that there's a growing body of knowledge around is that gender inequality impacts women's resilience to climate change and disasters. And in fact, ActionAid and the Economist Intelligence Unit a number of years ago collaborated to develop the South Asia Women's Resilience Index, which actually highlighted this vicious circle where you see gender inequality driving, women's exclusion from decision making. This then meaning that women are often excluded from plans and policies in relation to things like climate change and disasters. So when the crisis actually hits, it means that the response is actually gender blind, and it fails to address women's specific and diverse needs in a time of crisis. And then this means that the crisis actually disproportionately impacts women and results in further entrenchment of gender inequality. So it is a very, the cycle sort of continues. And I do encourage you to look at that piece of work because it's quite interesting, because it does point to the kind of factors that are critical to driving greater resilience among women. I think we could see that approach and that sort of approach is also very relevant in a context in the Pacific, which also has some of the lowest representation of women in decision-making in the world. I guess alongside this, we also see that in order to break the cycle, disaster can be a moment for disruption, and it can be a moment to shift power. And that's definitely part of the approach we're going to be talking about this morning. A couple of years ago, ActionAid and Monash University, working with partners in Vanuatu, Cambodia and Kenya, developed and started to look at how do we promote gender transformative and inclusive approaches in response to climate change and disasters. Approaches that could bridge this development humanitarian divide and stop us from looking at these things in silos, but really have a more coherent approach that would actually drive better responses in times of crisis, but also drive gender equality. So we wanted to share with you a framework, and Whitney, if you don't mind putting up the framework that I've shared with you, that was developed and which we're using today to kind of set the scene as to how we've structured this conversation. And so just very briefly, I think to explain this, I think there were 3 critical things that are essential to how we can drive gender responsive alternatives. This is really built on the experiences of women who are impacted by climate change and disasters. The first one is, how do we bridge women's traditional localized knowledge that's gained through their own experiences with the science and technology, the institutional knowledge? So how do we lift this more and recognise it and give it a place in more effective responses? Because this knowledge has effectively, from all of the communities we talk to, is often sidelined and ignored, and fails to really bring a more nuanced and locally relevant response. The second area you can see here is women's participation and how important it is that we continue to see women participating in spaces where decisions are made, both at the individual and collective level, but also recognising that women's participation should include diverse women's participation. And that's really how we're going to transform institutions to make them more relevant, and make sure that we are seeing greater decision-making by women, greater access to resources, and also some shift in the way women participate in influencing these spaces. And then the other sort of critical component is around bottom-up approaches. And what the research really pointed to was the importance of women's collective action and how we can support women's collectives as well as women's organisations in really driving effective responses. And that's really, and influencing, policy and planning at all levels, local, national and global. So this is a framework that we use when we're looking at how we can drive, I guess I would say, gender transformative and inclusive approaches alongside, and I guess what's integrated in here is how we shift harmful gender norms that continue to devalue women's knowledge, to exclude women's participation and to sideline women's collective action. So it is looking at those norms has also been a critical and integrated component of this. So just to share that framework, because that's kind of going to help and guide how we've set up the conversation today. So I think we can take that off, Whitney, and I think it's time for us to get into our conversation. So I guess to kick off with, I think we wanted to explore this notion around the importance of resourcing women's networks and women's collective action in driving gender transformative and inclusive development. So Sharon, I'd like to start with you, and I think perhaps if you could start by sharing what is the Shifting the Power Coalition and how is it supporting women-led organisations to shift power across the development and humanitarian divide in the Pacific?
Thanks, Michelle. And as you said, disasters can really be a moment to shift the power and to be transformative. And that's what happened in 2016 with experiences from TC Pam and TC Winston. We all came together to forge this coalition around making sure that the women's rights agenda, including disability rights, the rights of diverse women, was at the center of what our governments were doing. And so the coalition brings together the Pacific Disability Forum, other women-led civil society organizations from across the 7 Pacific Forum countries, including Australia, which is
Sharon, sorry, just to interrupt, your video is breaking up a little bit. I don't know whether you want to turn off your...
comes in. Supporting women's activism on driving. Yes, so what we're doing is we're concentrating on women's activism and driving that Pacific innovation within the framework of development, within the framework of disaster management and also climate change. And we bring also that expertise of humanitarian action. So today, we're able to connect with more than 100,000 women, including, as you said, ActionAid Vanuatu's own 4,000 strong Women Who Talk Together network. And what we're also doing, Michelle, is not just looking at women in a homogeneous approach. So that is why we have Indigenous Pacific women like Flora, Indigenous Pacific young women like Carolyn on this call, and hopefully Lanieta also joining from the disability sector. And our role as the coalition is to bring about that transformative change, but looking beyond just an organizational approach. It's bringing together and making the linkages across the Pacific, which we actually hadn't had a chance to do before 2016, beyond simple just crisis response. So we've been able to move, and particularly moving resources to get to women when they need. So just in, since 2019, when the coalition has commenced our rapid response grant making, we've made sure that more than 70,000 Australian dollars have reached local women leaders like Flora, like Ramona Tukanga in Samoa, like Lanieta, to be able to get women to undertake the kind of response that's needed when they're facing a crisis. And just in the past 2 weeks, we've been able to launch a very important initiative, I think, for Papua New Guinea and Bougainville within the bigger humanitarian space, with close to 830,000 Australian dollars being dedicated specifically for women to drive an agenda for the COVID-19 response. So Michelle, it's about women coming together and meeting and exchanging and learning together, but also working together so that we can indeed shift the power in terms of resources at the local level, but also in this big space of development and humanitarian action and disaster management, which tends still to be very patriarchal. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Sharon. And I think two really important messages that I think we hope that everyone takes away. And I think that is that we have to be careful about homogenizing women's experiences and really recognizing, the diversity of women's experiences and how we can reflect that in our approaches. And that is critical to driving more inclusive approaches. But also shifting the resources and that being a critical element of making sure that women do have resources to drive their own local responses, locally led responses. So thanks, Sharon. Flora, I might turn to you now. And particularly, I guess, I think it'd be lovely to hear about how ActionAid Vanuatu has been supporting, the formation of women's networks from the bottom up in Vanuatu, and I guess really supporting women to drive their own agenda and use disasters as an opportunity to transform the situation for women in Vanuatu.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. ActionAid Vanuatu started out of a disaster. So came in 2015 to respond to TCPAM as a category 5. And as my other colleague have said, from shifting to power. Our response work with the local Ni Vanuatu women who focused on their safety and dignity and rights in times of disaster. So we initially created the Women's Information Center, a safe space to come and access and share information about how the disaster was impacting their lives and their communities. So the tent were put in place as a starting point for Women to Talk Together Network Forum to be able to start. So we've created, before 2015, as Sharon said, there was nothing. We haven't come out together like this. And therefore, this disaster brings an opportunity that ActionAid in the Vinto created that safe space for women to connect, organize, collectively respond to the disaster in 3 of the locations that ActionAid Vanuatu came in by. So in Eton, in Eramango, and in Tana. So recently, last year, TC Harrow hit again, and this time it's in the northern part of the country. So ActionAid led a localized woman-led response. And this has led to the establishment of 2 more new WIT forums. So up in North, we've got Malo and Malekula that were hit in TC Harold. So currently having another membership of about 1,500, which we currently already having 4,000. So this 1,500 going on top of this 4,000. So now there's more women in the network. ActionAid is also the member of Shifting to Power Coalition. So as we have mentioned, known already when Sharon have given her remarks and talked about. So during this crisis that we had now for COVID-19, we have Vanuatu Young Women for Change, Vanuatu Disability Promotion Advocacy on the ground. So we joined in together as partnership, and we have worked together to support our constituency, who are local women and girls and women with disability, to lead their responses on the ground. So the Women Who Talk Together network is vibrant to date, working towards being an independent federated entity that brings out the local women's voices and leadership in disaster. So calling out for the protections of women and girls in times of crisis. So I think this is how we could see what Vanuatu from Women Who Talk Together, or what we are doing from the bottom-up approach perspective, and changing and transforming the lives of women by enabling them to be the first responders and training them to lead their own responses in times of crisis. So it's given us this opportunity. Without a disaster, we won't do that. But with a disaster, despite the crisis, the opportunity is there to enhance it and move it forward, and created that. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Flora. And I think they're emphasising a couple of really important issues around women having space to organise and mobilise around their own agenda, and that's, you know, obviously a key feature of the Women Who Talk Together network, and I think also the partnership among women's organisations on the ground, and I think that, you know, that's also really critical that we see and support that sort of, you know, collective power in trying to influence for change. We're now going to sort of shift to looking a little bit more at the need for diverse women's representation and participation in key decision-making spaces. And I will say we're hoping that Lanieta will be able to join us from Fiji Disabled People's Federation. I think we're still having a few challenges just getting her online, but we might start by looking at the situation for young women and actually bringing Carolyn into the conversation. Carolyn, it would be great to hear from you around, you know, I guess how the Shifting the Power Coalition is supporting young women to take leadership on climate change and to have the sort of the knowledge and skills to respond.
Thanks, Michelle. So within the coalition, there is a Young Women's Steering Committee that, you know, drives the agenda and the lobbying on young women's priorities. And these are diverse young women that represent other young women, you know, young women from the local YWCAs, young women professionals, young women from rural and remote communities, young women with disabilities. And this is because we understand the importance of having young women lead the conversations on their own experiences, because we have specific needs and different lived experiences as individuals. And in the cultural and, you know, socio-political environment that we must live in, spaces haven't been completely welcoming of the voices of young women. And through the coalition, you know, we're building young women's capacity to respond to climate change by giving them the resources that they need. You know, we're sitting down with these young women, we're listening to them, and we're understanding what it is that they need. It isn't just about giving them a lump sum of money to carry out projects. It's actually about understanding what it is that they need. And we're also connecting them to climate science experts. We're providing them with the information that they need to, you know, sort of bolster their own leadership in the movement. And through the coalition, we're not just being given the space to drive the agenda and, you know, communicate our priorities and recommendations. We're doing it through an intergenerational learning space with diverse older women who have been driving the movement, who have led the movement in the Pacific. And the Shifting the Power Coalition, you know, we know that it's made up of diverse women with a wealth of experience organizing in the feminist and peace building movements. And with that collective history of the different partners, we're learning to move forward by understanding where the movements have come from and what's worked, and we're working together to shape the response planning, you know, to better reflect the current situation that we live in.
That's great, Carolyn. And in fact, we felt that it would be great to sort of share, just, you know, also give a bit of space to some of the young women's voices from the coalition. So I know we've got a video that we just wanted to screen to show you, you know, firsthand how young women are lifting their voices.
Every day, Pacific women are rising up to respond to the challenges caused by the climate crisis.
Our oceans are getting warmer, and it's affecting our coral reefs and food sources. As the ocean changes, we are losing our traditional delicacies.
As sea levels continue to rise, we lose access to traditional plants, which are a source of medicine and used as well in the production of traditional crafts. Our people are relocating from their homes, the homes of our foremothers.
That is the reality, and as our government engage in global spaces and develop national action plans to adapt, we need to ensure these plans are ensuring climate justice for diverse young women across the Pacific.
The rural women who are managing food gardens and farms, all women with disabilities, recognizing their diverse needs and experiences.
To enable us to use Indigenous knowledge and climate science to build our community resilience.
Through the Shifting the Power Coalition, we are learning how to use information communication technology to prepare for and respond to crisis, collaborating with disaster management officials and ensuring protection with dignity in our community.
Now we have an opportunity to be climate smart, to enhance our collaboration with National Meteorology Office to determine how climate services and information can be accessible to communities connected to traditional knowledge and communications.
We will deepen our understanding of policy commitments and build alliances so that together we are making decisions that work for our communities.
We will develop recommendations based on how young women are accessing information and using communication platforms so that climate services and products are gender inclusive and accessible for all, including persons with disability. Our Shifting the Power Coalition's project, Pacific Young Women Responding to Climate Change, is supported by DFED's Australia Pacific Climate Partnership and is strengthening intergenerational learning among a network of young women leaders across Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, and Vanuatu. We will be equipped with climate science and traditional knowledge to redefine climate action, transforming it to climate justice. When young women are empowered with leadership skills, technical information, and provided access to decision-making, resources, and networks, we can provide solutions that will contribute to climate security by being weather ready and climate smart. Together, we are empowering and supporting each other as Pacific young women,
building confidence and leadership, because we want climate action to be meaningful and ensure no one is left behind.
Equipped with climate science and traditional knowledge, we will mobilize more young women to influence village, district, and provincial planning. Speak to development partners, including donors, to explain not why, but how to invest in our actions. Talk to us, listen to us,
plan with us,
Resource us.
join us as we cultivate a movement of creative, innovative, young women leaders through our Shifting the Power Coalition.
So hopefully you could all follow that, and I think some important messages in there from young women directly around just the value of having access to the climate science and knowledge directly, but also a very powerful call that when we're thinking about gender transformative and inclusive development, we have to make sure we are listening to those most impacted. So that includes young women, and planning with them and engaging them rather than doing things for them. And I think that's a critical component of the Shifting the Power Coalition's work. I know that we're hoping to have Lanieta with us, and I can't see her online yet. But Sharon, so I might just turn to you. And I think that, you know, the coalition has really targeted sort of two critical groups in its efforts, and one has been young women and the other one has been women with disabilities. And I guess it would be good to hear, you know, some reflections from you just on how the coalition is trying to support the leadership of women with disabilities.
Thanks, Michelle. One of the things that we have started to do since last year is to get resources to women on the ground as focal points. So we have a team of young women focal points, and we also have Lanieta Tuimabu, as well as Nellie Caleb in Vanuatu as our gender and disability focal points. So one of the reasons that we're doing that is to not just assume that we know what we need to get done when it comes to women's disabilities and the response on driving a women's rights agenda within the context of disability. So we get to learn from both Nellie and Lanieta. We learn with Angie Chund, who's with the Pacific Disability Forum. And with that in mind, we're able to develop the kinds of toolkits, the training packages, and the kinds of responses that are needed. So that's at one level. The other level is also looking at the intersectionality, particularly for young women with disabilities. And we saw this just in the last week in Papua New Guinea, where young women who were participating in our Mary Got Power, Mary Got Information Inception workshop talked about the fact that this was for them sitting at the table for the first time to really think about what were their needs as young women with disabilities in terms of the COVID-19 response. And once again, that is really important, because within the feminist practice, we're not going to assume we know what is needed. The third issue, I think, that is also really important, and in talking to Lanieta just recently as part of our monthly check-in with our focal points, is recognizing also that there are very specific needs for women with disabilities during disasters, during humanitarian crisis situations like COVID-19, and also during when we have other humanitarian crisis situations. And that's about that double burden that we talk about in terms of the care work, but the double burden in terms of women's rights and then the disability exclusion factor. So right now in Suva, one of the things that we are able to do as able-bodied women from home is easily access provisions from supermarkets, etc. But Lanieta pointed out yesterday for me that when a young woman who is a mother with and she has a child, she doesn't have that freedom or safety to even go to the supermarket. So how do we also ensure that their specific needs are accounted for in the response and taken into account in recovery and development? And that is needed, whether she's a young woman with a physical disability or psychosocial needs, how does that happen? So working with the women leaders within the disability sector is a continuous learning piece of work, but also it makes sure that as the coalition, we are also desegregating the kind of information that needs to lead to that needs to get to decision makers. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Sharon. And I mean, I hope that in terms of sharing sort of good practices and approaches, that, intersectionality really means also, from the coalition's perspective, is about lifting the voices of diverse women and giving them space to define and drive their own responses, rather than just someone else doing that kind of assessment, and a really important practical ways that is being brought to life through the coalition's work. Before we move on from this theme around, women's representation and participation in decision-making spaces, we have to turn to you, Flora, and particularly given that Vanuatu is one of the few countries in the world that has no women in its national parliament. Maybe that will change this week. But I guess it'd be good to hear how the Women Who Talk Together network, and through that, how ActionAid is trying to support women to have a voice on issues affecting their lives.
Thank you very much for that. So I'd like to say that the existence of Women Who Talk Together network is very critical in Vanuatu at the moment. As you rightly mentioned, there are no women on Parliament who can actually table our own key issues when it comes to gender inside the parliamentary space. And when we look at participation means we have to be there to table our own issues. We don't want a middle person, a second person to talk. A male person, a male figure talking about a woman issue is not relevant because they do not walk in our own shoes. We drive our own agenda, and we were supposed to be the one in there doing the participation. So through the network, we have therefore taken public advocacy role, engaging policy actors to talk about how disasters and climate change are impacting women's life. So we engage through ActionAid, getting the WIT network inside spaces like the provincial space. We don't usually engage in there, but the crisis have pushed us to the limit that participations and decision-making spaces are lack of our representation. Therefore, over the 5 years that ActionAid invested within the Women Who Talk Together network, last year from TC Harold and this year, you could see the fruitful and the transformation that has made that those spaces are now relevant for us to engage on. So we sit on, a good example was around COVID-19, when we have our national government with Ministry of Health is actually putting out awareness. Therefore, our Women in Talk Together network are also in that space to do the planning. We had our first first infected person, which is a male person who came in from the US, and he got infected. For us to plan, it is something that the government wasn't aware when they were looking at how they will integrate the person back into the community. And being in that space as ActionAid, the Women in Talk Together network are feasible there. So they help with the government plan on integration of this male person back because of the stigma that was there in the society. So therefore, we look at our issues, how we plan it, and it is an important strategy to move within. So we are now inside those PEOC center, like Provincial Emergency Operations Center. We engage on those levels. If ActionAid is not here, our local Vanuatu woman wouldn't be in those spaces. But because of the support and the investment that we had and the feminist approach that we drive, enable Vanuatu local women like me to engage in those policy making places and transform some of the decision-making bodies into getting our real issues there and telling them this is what it takes for you to go to a community and don't only look at men on this side, but please look inclusively and look at it in a holistic approach, not only one size fits all. So this is one of the messages we were driving in some of those spaces, and that's what ActionAid is doing. And this time, as I'm speaking, our parliamentary is not stable. Our government is not really stable at the moment. 19 of them have been vacated from parliament, and we were hoping that it's time for the women to rise and shine in this parliamentary crisis. So I am just vouching for women leaders around Vanuatu, to step up for this challenge. So I think it's our time. Thank you.
Thanks, Flora, and we hope that it is your time, and that this sort of moment of political disruption can also open opportunities, to shift that situation for women in Vanuatu. But I think I think there's an important sort of element in terms of what you're saying around the role that development organisations can play in actually opening space for local women's voices to influence at different levels. That it is very hard to crack through that. In a sort of a patriarchal environment. So opening that space and enabling it seems like a really important thing for starting to shift and transform those relations. I wanted to move on to this area of recognising Indigenous knowledge. It's something right from the coalition's inception. I recall, Pacific women saying how important it is that we lift women's Indigenous knowledge. And so it was no surprise then to when through the work with Monash, we were able to document how critical that is to more effective responses to climate change and disasters. So I guess, Sharon, to start with you, why is this so important, and how do we bridge the gap between the science and local knowledge?
Well, one of the first steps that we are taking as the coalition, Michelle, is as the young women are saying in the video, through our Young Women's Project, is to bring young women and older women, Indigenous women together to sit and learn from the technical experts, whether they're from the Met Office or climate scientists. So that's one step. But in the context and just building on what Flora was just talking about as well, when we talk about governance systems, there's a real need to also understand that for Pacific Island women, in terms of their Indigenous representation, but also within the traditional governance systems, there is also a need to focus on the fact that we have dual governance systems. And so if we can't just focus on the fact that we're not in parliament or municipal councils, but how do we also get Indigenous women and local women into those traditional governance systems at the local level, where whether it's in the family unit or the village unit, building up all the way into the provincial council units, and then that is part of that, leading into national decision making. So I would echo exactly what you said, that development agencies must ensure that development planning takes into account where women are not. The other thing also is, in the context of the Pacific Islands, we actually belong to a generation where we are seeing our islands disappearing, where we are experiencing the climate change through intensifying weather patterns. And Flora's example of how women first came together into the local hubs in the response to TC-PAM, and then being able to organize and mobilize for TC Herald is a very classic example of the fact that the traditional and Indigenous knowledge of Pacific women is actually shaping the way in which disaster management and humanitarian is organized. And that is also building on traditional and Indigenous knowledge, because even before, the onset of internet and SMS and all of that, we had the knowledge. Our foremothers knew what needed to be done for disaster preparedness before the cyclone season, or how to dry fish and other food, and what to do to ensure that our root crops weren't damaged. So we need to have that combination, because the science is important. It provides very important evidence, but it as equally important is the traditional and Indigenous knowledge coming particularly from women who continue to play that very important leadership role in local communities. Michelle.
Thanks, Sharon. And in a moment, Flora, I'd love to hear if you have any examples of how, women's Indigenous traditional knowledge, localized knowledge is sort of coming to the fore in Vanuatu. But can I just ask if you do have any questions or would like to make some kind of comment? I mean, if you can indicate in the chat, because, we would like to allow some time for that. So just a reminder, and that could also be your own reflections from your own research and thinking around some of these issues. But Flora, can I just pass over to you to see if you have anything you want to add on this issue of Indigenous knowledge?
Thank you so much for that. Indigenous knowledge, for me and for the network that we have learned over the years that what we actually been passed on from our ancestors are there and are real. For example, we know already that when there's a fruity, the mangoes are so ripe and there's a lot of fruits that we will be harvesting any of this month, we know there's a cyclone coming, and that was passed from generation to generation. And you could only tell by also plants, or that's by the plants. And if you're looking at insects, a cockroach started to fly widely inside our community or in our home or wherever you are, you will expect showers, rain will come in slide probably a minute or 2 minutes after that. And those are the traditional signs that we have. And we have a lot that we do for preservance of food security, of water, and those examples of traditional knowledge that we embedded. And when we, inside the Woman Talk Together, we have seen those things coming. We identified them, we've known it, we actually approached them. Like for TC-PAM, the woman did approach the husband in the villages to say that there's a cyclone coming. And did you think they listened to us? They did not. They did not even listen to us to prepare. And we have to struggle our own self to try and get the kids to a safe place, trying to make sure that the food and the water and documentations are kept in that time of crisis. So it should be listened at with our traditional knowledge, but people just seem to doesn't look at it this way. But we don't want to be undervalued. So our local women, we have this knowledge and we can actually enhance it. When you look at it scientifically, within Woman Talk Together, there's Woman Weather and Weather, and Woman Weather and Weather bring in the scientific knowledge, and that's when they look at the Met's office reports of weather, and then they link it to what we are doing. So it sort of speaks to the local traditional knowledge that we already there, but more within the scientific, based on how the clouds are reacting, the weather, the sun, if it goes too red, but you can tell that, no, the weather pattern says this, the report says that. So then it helps to plan better our gardening, plan better if we wanted to organize something for the women. We know there'll be rain next week, we do not. It's because of the scientific bridge that we had, and our other network, Woman Weather and Weather, is driving that on the ground. And through shifting to power as well, we linked that into young women's with where Carolyn came on. So it really fits well. So through these practices that we had, we know we can tell cyclones coming, drought, prolonged. So I think what we really need is the shared learning across our region, and also enhancing that you won't be dealing with only that, you have to integrate the scientific one in. So bridge that gap, getting those weather reports. We need technology improvement. We need to know the survey. We need to know what's the scientific terms now. How is the scientific approach on climate change? So we are dealing with climate change every day, and Vanuatu hit with 7 in a week or in a month. So thus we can have the acid rain, the ash falls, we can have the drought, we can have no water because there's the water portal, sea level rise came up, we can have strong winds at the same time. So 7 disasters happening in one place at once. I think probably 8, including pandemic COVID-19. So yeah.
Thanks, Flora. So yeah, and I think an important thing, because I know that we have a number of researchers on, also joining this call. I mean, I think that there's a crucial element there around how do we continue to lift this Indigenous knowledge, document it, value it, and give it a place alongside the science, as well as how do we, as we saw from the example with the young women, around how do we also make sure that science and knowledge is also reaching communities. I can see we have a question here, and I do, as I say, I encourage you to put questions, comments, reflections around, work with men and boys, and how do we make sure they're also on board in terms of shifting the power and the agenda. I might come to you about that in a moment, Sharon, and maybe you can share some of the work that's being thought about through the cross-gender dialogues. But before I do, I guess I just wanted to touch upon this notion of gender norms. And I mean, it really speaks to, the whole topic of this session, which was around, the future is feminist, and the importance of feminist approaches in how we can actually shift power and drive more gender transformative and inclusive development. So I'd like to go to you, Carolyn. I guess when we think about that notion around feminism and the need for feminist approaches, do young women in the Pacific see feminism as critical to progress on gender equality?
As a movement and in critical discourse, yes, because we know that women have been disadvantaged by a system propped up by the patriarchy. And while multilateral agreements on gender equality are being made, renewed, and reviewed, and then amplified by local actors, we're still missing feminist leadership and peace-building perspectives in the places that actually matter. And the lack of diverse women's voices in decision-making spaces sort of undermines the progress, the work that we're doing towards making a future that is more gender equal. And when we say the future is feminist, we're actually looking at, disrupting the current status quo of, literally shifting the power to something that's more collective. We're creating the safe spaces within the coalition to build young women's capacity and promoting their leadership. And by supporting diverse women and young women's leadership, we're challenging those current social norms. We're amplifying our voices in different spaces through different movements. And that's why for us, it's important to carry on the work that's happening through the feminist and peace-building movements, and to have those principles at the forefront of our own advocacy. But I think while it's important to continue to work for that gender equal future, we also need to acknowledge the work that is being done now by diverse women, young women, women like Lanieta and Sharon, Brianna in New Zealand, Helena in Port Moresby. This is the leadership that needs to be amplified if we're going to be talking about a future that is feminist.
Fantastic, Carolyn. I think it's, and I think really points to how feminist leadership can really drive more inclusive responses, and also support, mentor, create that safe space for new generations of young feminist leaders. So thank you. I think that's really, inspiring to hear about. So Sharon, I'd love to hear a little bit just in the reflection on this question we have around how are we engaging men? How do we engage men as part of shifting the power?
How do we engage men? I think that's a really important conversation to have more broadly in terms of the feminist movement. But the starting point for me is, unfortunately, you know, we're sitting in 2021 and we haven't attained those gender equality goals, those aspirational goals that, you know, were committed to through the Beijing Platform for Action, or by our governments that have ratified CEDAW, the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So when we still have that power imbalance, I think one, for us as the Shifting the Power Coalition, we must continue to invest in supporting women to claim the power that they have been marginalized from, and then to be able to identify processes within our traditional governance systems, within our Indigenous and local spaces, as well as within the political spaces. And that's been the approach that two of our partners have taken. One, the Nazareth Center for Rehabilitation in Bougainville, which really emerged, you know, from the crisis in Bougainville, to identify ways to work with men, to work with former combatants, to build peaceful communities, and to work with them consistently, you know, to become allies of the women's movement. And then we have Transcend Oceania in Fiji, which has developed a space that has dedicated spaces for women to still have that time and space and resources to sit down, like Virginia Woolf said, you know, to write what they feel is really important, to prepare, to then engage in a facilitated process, to engage with men who tend to be, you know, the male leaders, the chiefs, the other decision makers at that village community level. And also supporting, quite interestingly, a process where men coming from their traditional leadership roles as the, in inverted commas, the head of the household, to also really understand what do you mean by gender equality? How do you become a partner for your woman, for your wife, for your partner, in your home, in your community as well? And I think the final point I want to also raise in terms of working with men is not forgetting the role of our Pacific churches. So this is really where, you know, through the YWCA movement, we have always taken that approach of engaging or applying the Christian basis to feminist practice. And I'm glad to say that, you know, not just because he's my brother, but we are now seeing that when you have a feminist church leader as the head of the, you know, the Pacific Conference of Churches, that those institutions are also being asked to think about what are they doing around power imbalances, what have they been doing to promote gender-based violence, etc., and make those changes. So there are opportunities to be transformative in community and institution. But Michelle, I think for us as a feminist coalition, we must also continue to retain that space for women. Thanks.
Thanks, Sharon. I can see we also had another question from Annalise, just around how climate crisis and disasters are driving and increasing gender-based violence, and a desire to hear how we're responding. I have to say, we've only probably got another 2 minutes before we wrap up. So, and I would like to give everyone just a chance to have some quick closing remarks. But just to say, I mean, ActionAid Vanuatu does do quite a lot of work around community-based protection as a way that local women are able to define and drive their own approaches to protection and responding to violence and broader protection threats that they face. And so please do get in touch with Flora if you would like to, you know, have more information about that work. I'm sure she'd be happy to share. I guess we are sort of at the end of this session before I hand over to Whitney. And I guess we wanted to wrap up by really just giving a chance for each of our speakers just to offer, you know, a sort of an insight, a takeaway for all of you around what's critical in driving gender transformative and inclusive development. So perhaps Flora, if I can go to you first, just a quick reflection.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the listeners and everybody that are here at this moment. So for me, I'd like to just say that locally led approaches have lasting impacts. Ownership, they own it. And as local women, we have fingers on the soil. We understand the local context and people way of life, realities and the deeper issues that might not be in the service, like violence against women and injustice that we go through. But because we are women, we are approaching everything holistically and looking at it in a new lens each time there's a crisis. And just to make note that a disaster, we have used to now learn that you can table it in terms of, gender equality. This is the arena you will look at it. Climate change is not only climate change, but is a driven agenda for me to transform the lives of women and my community leaders in terms of letting them know about gender equality and gender-based violence, decreasing it at that area also. So thank you.
Thanks, Flora. Carolyn?
Just want to say, listen to us as young women. Talk to us about how we can work better together. Recognize that different solutions will work for different communities, different people. And if we want sustainability in the movement and creating social changes, then we must create the meaningful and accessible opportunities to overcome the barriers that hinder diverse young women's participation in leadership and decision-making. Because we know that, and we've experienced that at the end of the day, the process matters just as much as the end result.
Thank you so much. And Sharon, final reflection.
Well, Michelle, what we did when we came together in 2016 was to say we can't keep having a mainstreaming approach to disaster management, humanitarian action, or crisis response. And that's why we're shifting the power together 5 years on. But I also just want to say what we still need to continue to do, particularly with the support of development agencies and partners, is redesigning the table. Please don't only think about adding one woman to the mix and then you're going to achieve gender equality or women's rights. Work with coalitions like the Shifting the Power Coalition so that we can ensure that young women like Carolyn, rural women, women leaders like Flora, women with disabilities, trans women are at the table determining the future, particularly when we're not just facing the COVID pandemic, but also the climate crisis. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Well, I hope that you've all enjoyed this session and that we've been able to show, I guess, really how critical it is to have women's participation, resourcing of women's networks, as well as the value of women's knowledge as key drivers for more gender inclusive and transformative development, as well as feminist approaches that do shift the norms, and that you've seen this in practice, what it looks like directly from the people most affected. So a big thank you to our three speakers. Apologies that we're unable to get Lanieta online. And I'm just going to hand over to Whitney to close the session.
I'm on mute. Of course I am. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. It has been hopefully a very informative and super interesting roundtable. Thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences. If I can get you all to pop your feedback into the Google link that I'm just putting up onto the chat now, that would be really, really excellent. And thank you again for joining us. And again, if you haven't purchased a ticket, please do head over to the conference website and purchase a ticket. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.